speaking from São Paulo. McKenzie, you were here about 2 months ago. We had the opportunity to meet in person, and it's wonderful to meet again, even if online. Well, McKenzie Wark may not need an introduction, but let's go ahead anyway. McKenzie Wark is an Australian-born writer and scholar known for her writings on media theory, critical theory, new media, and the Situationist International. In 2023, she published the book Raving, which explores the queer and trans rave scene in New York. She's also a professor of media and cultural studies at the New School. I've been very happy to see the reach that Raving has achieved with several translations of the book. By the way, we're looking forward to having it translated into Portuguese here in Brazil. McKenzie, what have you prepared for us today?
All right, so let me find my share screen. Here we go, and begin that. There we are. All right, so I wanted to think about rave as practice as sort of maybe a way to come at party as form, which is the theme for the whole series. And as Leo mentioned, this book is it's been getting around, and it's in a few languages. And I wrote Raving as sort of like a love letter or a returning of the gift of what the Brooklyn queer and trans rave scene had given me. So it's about a very specific world, but it turns out it resonates with people's experiences in other parts of the world as well. Oops, sorry, that's for a different version of this talk. In terms of genre, you know, maybe it's critical auto theory is one thing I came up with to describe it, or sort of the auto textual. I'm interested in the sensory particulars and how that relates to sort of social technical totalities. And I wanted a writing that is keyed in at the same time to percept, affect, and concept, to give it the Deleuzean triad. And that it's all about practices, like what are cultural practices that we find necessary and sustaining at the moment. Yeah, so maybe it's auto text would be the genre, and it's sort of part of an art with these other books. Pardon me. And the practices these books were about was maybe fucking, dancing, and crying is sort of like the three that I've done so far. I'm quite sure what the next one would be. So the book centers on the Brooklyn queer rave scene from roughly 2017 to 2003 is when the field work stopped. But I found out I need this in my life, so I sort of I kept going. I sort of came back to raving after like 20-year chill out. I was introduced to techno, and you know, in Berlin in the 90s. I didn't really understand it at the time. And then I had an experience in Sydney with sort of like the warehouse scene. But after I came out as trans, I felt like I really needed dancing and collaborative dancing with others in my body, and this was the world that I found. And I think it's sort of like a precious little one. I wanted to sort of document it and share something about it. So how does one a rave ethnographer without being completely detached from the scene? And in anthropology, there's this division between the sort of the inside perspective and the outside perspective. And I was interested in something that's a little bit sort of liminal in between the two. I've also thought that maybe there's things I can contribute from the skills that I have to this world. So rather than just extract from it, what can I bring to it? So with Jeff Mack and Zoe Beery, I co-curate Writing on Raving, where we do a reading series that's in a nightclub, sort of like bringing a space of sort of reflection into the club kind of before the night starts. And I've sort of been curating collections of writing. This one was for Factory International in Manchester, centering trans of color voices and the experience of dancing and nightlife. And with Madison Moore, I co-edited Black Rave, where we wanted to center Black and queer stories around, not so much around house music, but also around techno. There's a sort of, we felt there was a missing piece of sort of research and documentation around that. So we did that one together. And I really want to emphasize that, to me, this is mostly a techno-centered world, and techno is black music, and I feel like an uninvited guest into a culture. And when you are an uninvited guest, then you have to figure out the protocol of what you owe your host. And so the book is part of that. These were three books that were really key to me for thinking about that. You may all know the Undercommons, the concept of surround was what I got out of that. There's like a sonic resonance in that book. Kotoishin's More Brilliant Than the Sun, which really changed how I hear. And the more recent DeForest Brown Jr., who's a New York friend, Assembling a Black Counterculture is this kind of essential work, putting together the entire history of Black techno from its origins. And in terms of ways of writing, sorry about the typo, in the Anglophone world, people think autofiction was invented by a bunch of straight people like 5 minutes ago. And it's like, this is gay shit. Like autofiction is something Jean Genet came up with in Our Lady of the Flowers, which is a bunch of prison masturbation stories that are maybe about her own transness, is what's great about that. Highly recommend the work of Guillaume Dostin as if folks could mute, I would appreciate that. So I'm not getting sound in my headphones. Dostin has sort of changed the literary style, but I think is continuing in that space. And shout out to Black American progenitors of the auto text, Audre Lorde and Sam Delaney. So in looking at the Brooklyn queer and trans rave scene, just as sort of method and ethics, like who are the organic intellectuals who are already there? Like I'm not bringing, like the concept to it. The conceptual work's already being done. It's a question of who by. So Tim Froelich on the left, Jasmine and Infinity in the middle, on the right, were among the range of people that it's not like I'm getting their perceptions and then conceptualizing it. The concepts are already there, and the conceptual dimension of raving is crowdsourced in that sense. And I've tried to acknowledge that in the book as much as possible. There's Tim with his own self-published book. Like Tim didn't know what to do with himself during the lockdown when he couldn't dance, so he just wrote a whole book about it instead. Love him. And there's already spaces where the internal tensions in this scene come out and are publicly discussed. This is a town hall at the nightclub Nowadays, which is also one of our sites for writing and raving, that was centering questions around transness and blackness in the scene and its marginalization, and the fact that the promoters and club owners and venue owners and landlords are nearly all straight white guys. So where is this happening? Bushwick, Brooklyn. It's sort of one of those places that's generating its own mythology at the moment in ways that are problematic, because it means my rent is going to go up. But this is sort of more or less the area. Brooklyn doesn't have hard defined edges around neighborhoods, so as to where Bushwick begins and ends is ambiguous, but somewhere around that wiggly creek at the top and the green park at the bottom right is where most of the energy might be centered, if you like. But I'm interested in the sort of psychogeography of neighborhoods. When does it feel like you are in a thing that we could collectively call Bushwick? And even if parts of it are in Queens, in a completely different borough, like the feeling of when you're in that space was sort of more interesting than the boundaries of it to me. So the research covered the lockdown period. So I started before, then we're in the lockdown, and then there's after, and it changed the texture. New promoters emerged, and there were parties all through the lockdown too. But the ones I actually attended were outdoors, and this was hugely controversial in the scene because we risked spreading COVID. My approach to this, and it's only partially defensible, is, I live in community with people for whom COVID was not the only threat to life. There were already multiple existing threats to life, and we're doing our best to reduce harm on a number of fronts simultaneously. And one of the harms that's likely to occur is isolation, that queer and trans people, if we can't have community with each other, we're vulnerable. Less me, but more the people I'm in community with. And you know, we lost people because of the isolation to suicide and overdose in this time. So I think it's partially defensible to think that we kind of needed these spaces, and need is central. It's even, I think, in the first sentence of the book, what is need here? This was a Black Lives Matter protest that turned into a rave that ended up in Red Hook section of Brooklyn, right by the water, and you can see the Statue of Liberty in the background. Last set of photos I did on my old iPhone before I got the 11 with much better camera, which completely changed what I could document, but that's a story I'll get to later. There were rooftop raves at that time because you could get the gear basically for nothing. So there was a kind of spontaneous recreation of what it was that we needed all through the lockdown period. But there are also things like this rail yard rave, which was chaos. The bill had musical artists from different genres, and it brought people from all over the city who don't usually encounter each other in nightlife, because New York nightlife is segregated along several axes. So this brought communities together who then had to figure out how to interact with each other. And there's some documentation from that. It was my roommate's girlfriend on the left. We left this one early and the police showed up shortly after. It was in a rail yard. So some questions that come up doing this work was how to sort of understand emergent culture, like how is something coming into being emergent, being a Raymond Williams category. And I'm very preoccupied with how do we see, hear, and feel the present, like what is the contemporary? Thinking what the modern was always had, you know, like at least 2 points. Modern is a relation between 2 points in time. The contemporary is not, and I think it's harder to think. But maybe if you go to where the experimental practice is, you've got the emergence of language and affect and concepts going on. So where is that, and how do you become part of that? Given that I'm older than most of this world and from a previous era in nightlife, so how can I find a role in that? Like, where is a position I can occupy, which turned out to be rave mom a lot of the time. I'm the one bringing water up the front and that sort of thing, and everybody's confessor, and I was asked for a letter of recommendation on the dance floor once, you know, so it's like, okay, so I'm being positioned in a certain way here as included, but on the edge of it. And then how do you find a literary form to sort of express this? And I've addressed that with thinking through the autotextual. And then another question that I got very interested in was like, who are the expressive social types? And as a city person, you tend to read the world through, you know, classification of people. Like you get a few seconds as you step onto the train to figure out whether the person to your right is psychotic enough to attack you, or whether maybe you should go to the left. And, you know, so that there's ways that you operate very quickly in how you know, read people. So I got interested in who the types are, and this came out of reading T.J. Clark and the way that the anomie of urban space was already creating ways that people became legible to each other. And Clark's, I think, really interesting example is young women in the workforce and things like nightlife. And here's the Impressionist doing young woman at work who then has some degree of autonomy and income, and then young women at play, because then leisure becomes a category that's available. So I've done previous work on social types. So there was the Hacker Manifesto and Gamer Theory. Kind of got the title wrong myself as Hacker Manifesto, Gamer Theory, and then Raver I was interested in that as social type, and how is that illustrative of certain practices in the 21st century in particular. But then the raver is not alone on the dance floor, and one of the things about, you know, party as form is the way that there's ambiguity as to what kinds of need and what kinds of activity it's there for. And to just give 5 of the social types that one would think through New York nightlife. This one, you know, Punisher and co-worker I got from the scene, you know. Punisher is someone who thinks that they're having a good time is at your expense. And not exclusively, but very often, you know, cishet white men who think every party is for them and will bulldoze their way to the front and just fucking stand there. They don't dance. They don't know how to dance, you know, and they empty their beer can on your head. So Punisher, you know, there's other versions of there are Punishers internal to the scene, but that's the most often Punisher you encounter, and it's why I do not show up until after peak hours when they've got drunk and gone home. Co-worker is a little different, and I often am the co-worker. Co-worker is someone who needs the release of a night out because of work stress, and they're looking for like a big time, and they're likely to go a little too hard too early. Um, think bachelorette parties in the gay club all going, woo, is co-worker energy. And you know, co-worker is fine, but sometimes they're just at it a little too hard too early, and they're not experienced with the long haul of what a rave is actually about, you know. So again, another reason to wait till that crowd has passed through. Circuits or circuit gay is gay men who live substantially in nightlife, and it comes from the once being a circuit of parties that they would go to one after the other, and their use of the dance floor includes cruising, and there are very particular conventions around that, and a lot of queer parties in New York include sex on the premises. It is kind of hilarious to watch circuits be on Grindr on the dance floor. And it's like, girl, there's trade all around you, you know. So there's you know, like tension that has to be handled very carefully between circuit use of space and other queer uses of space. And one of the interesting shifts in New York was from house music as being the dominant music for circuit gay parties to techno, which is sometimes not, which sometimes has a different kind of queerness attached to it. You might also encounter club kids who are much more interested in documenting their presence. A lot of more interesting parties, you know, photography, if it's not banned, is definitely frowned on to have your camera out, or even your phone out on the dance floor is bad behavior. But club kids want to document themselves and each other as having been present, and you know, it's an important use of the space for people who count for nothing in the rest of the world, because they're often marginalized in the sense of being young and queer and sometimes trans and of color. This is where they're special, and there are particular parties that cater to that. You sometimes Raver butts up against that as well, and it's okay, honey. So if you're doing all that, we'll just be on the other side of the dance floor. Raver is sort of a slightly different use of the space of nightlife to all of the above, and characterized by thinking in terms of endurance, of thinking in terms of, you know, come around to the sort of states you're trying to collectively generate by dancing in close proximity to other people for very long stretches of time, with or without some sort of chemical assistance around that. So like ravers, I think, are more specific use, and you're more likely to encounter ravers. Legal nightlife ends at 4 a.m. in New York City, so you're more likely to find it after that at the illegal parties that happen after that. After 4 a.m., you also get people who work in nightlife coming to raves. You get sex workers who don't have clients past that time usually. So there's sort of like a different mix of people starts to happen 4 5 a.m. through to noon or wherever, and that's sort of more the temporal chunk of this that I'm interested in. So I'm interested in the intersection of sort of avant-garde, bohemians, and subcultures, and I won't get into elaborate definition of those three overlapping sort of lenses that you can put on collective cultural practices. And the sort of anchor historically for me thinking about that was Situationist International, which I think was all three. It kind of oscillated between all three. So I'm interested in how did the intersection of those three things reoccur? Like, where does it reoccur in sort of what form later? And things I learned from studying situations was sort of the idea of street ethnography, that there's things to be learned from people whose slogan is never work, one of the more interesting early situation slogans. Really hard to do in Brooklyn now because like the rents are too damn high. So everybody's really got 3 jobs, but they're not legal. It's more where we're coming at with that. So it's avoidance of regular work and seeking of income in nightlife itself. But where there's a kind of experimental collective practice of, you know, making it possible to sort of live outside of straight life. the other thing I learned from the situationists is always ask the women what's going on, like, because you will get the tea, like they know. There's usually like some guy who's presenting himself as like the great spokesperson for the scene. It's like, all right, what do the women behind you say about it, And that's more generalizable, is ask those people who are other in this world what that experience is like. And you often get a very different perspective on it. I learned that these are my two informants in working on I prefer to work with living people than in the archives. I'm, like not a great archival scholar. I'm much more, I came out of journalism, so I'm much more a fieldwork person. But this is Michelle Bernstein and Jacqueline Guillaume, who passed not long ago, were important informants for me in working on situationists. So just to touch on three emergent topics. Um, that all of this runs on precarious labor, and it's people whose day jobs are also precarious labor, and then how has that become uh, a way of life that centers a particular relation to temporality. Don't imagine having long careers of like building one step after the other. And how does that mesh with the sense of temporality of the rave itself and of techno as a musical genre? What are the techniques that make it all possible is interesting to me. And I didn't mean to make myself popular when I showed up again after the 20-year break by saying this is better than raves were 20 years ago, that it's sort of the people were open to that, because there's always this narrative of like, you missed it, like, oh, you missed it. Like this scene was amazing a year ago or 10 years ago, and I'm like, fuck that. I missed the 60s, and I kept getting told I'd missed it. And it's like, fuck that. We're going to make the 80s really awesome. And we did. So I always want to encourage people to think it's happening now, and you don't need to, have that sense of FOMO about the past. It's just like, oh, all right, so it's doable. The past tells you these things can be created. Let's create it now. But the techniques make it kind of actually pretty easy on one dimension. Uh, CDJs will get you sub bass that you cannot get out of vinyl, and it completely changes the sonic texture of party form. It's great. I love it. I'm someone who climbs into sub bass bins. Like that sonic texture actually was not really possible to produce in the sort of the vinyl only era. I still love vinyl DJs, so but the techniques, and then that you can there's a sound system you can rent, pretty much off the rack. The pieces of lighting you can get off the rack, and they're LED and computer controlled now. The tools to create temporary situations, constructed situations, vastly improved. The crowd that's coming to these parties has changed, and that changes the texture. It's a mix of knowledge workers, service workers, including sex workers, and then people whose job is nightlife and just kind of service work too. So like, what is it about the, sort of like having an email job that makes rave necessary as a thing that gets you back into your physicality, which I think is very different to the sort of working class English rave of the late 80s. Sort of Summer of Love was very much about a former industrial working class whose jobs have been taken away in the sort of neoliberal Thatcher era. So it performed a different function in relation to labor. So to think about the sort of class composition of who comes and how it's service and knowledge work is the kind of crowd that we're dealing with here. So how do you make images of this? I want to do a book with pictures. And you can take pictures in the club. They're often very stereotypical. Like there's a lot of nightlife images that always seem to be the same picture. So I just wanted to think about that a little differently. On the left is January Hunt, important person in the scene, on her birthday, getting a birthday cake. There's a lot of before and after pictures, like this sort of Instagram before and after. So that's me and a friend. I think that's got to be before the party because our makeup hasn't melted off our faces. But I actually document these scenes that are sort of officially no photo, although there's always a little cheating around the edges of that with sort of like a question. So how do you expose the night, and how to sort of not be a tourist with your camera? And what are the boundaries of what's exposable? How do we be sort of alongside and then among the scene, because the camera sort of pushes you out of it a little bit? And can we make the situation visible rather than isolating like an individual figure in it or something like that? Can we photograph the feeling of it rather than the form? So this image I took after a party had officially ended to document the lighting, which in this case was by Kip Davis. And that was more where I wanted to go with it. Can I photograph the ambience itself? Um, I'm interested in the history of sort of nightlife photography. This was famous work about the milieu that gave rise to the Situationists. I just did that as a comic strip some time ago. I'm interested in how you photograph trans people, and I ended up not, I took the figure out of it because I don't think this is an easily solvable problem. I love Krista Stroholm's like nightlife photos from Paris in the early 60s, but it's the cis gays, like it's sort of the othering of the trans body. I'm kind of over that. I love Nan Golden, and these are photos of Greer Langton. Uh, but Nan Golden stuff plays into this existing trope of Bohemia as a space of tragedy. And, like this work just repeats La Boheme. Like we've been telling this story now for over a century. So how do we sort of not do that? Elegance Bratton's work, Bound by Night, first photographer found who was doing interesting stuff with ballroom, which is a different scene, sort of adjacent, but not my world to document. This book's hard to find, but I found that one was useful. And, there are plenty of trans writers and artists returning the cis gaze and coming up with a different way of framing the visible, starting with Juliana Huxtable. I just love this image of her as self-portrait that's called the Untitled Socio-Psychic Stun. So it's kind of like the fuck off stare that trans women in particular need to learn, because if you return the gaze, you're no longer an object, and it might accelerate getting a beating or it might drive it away. Is sort of like the role of it in relation to the cis gaze. So that's a photo of one of the organizers of a party putting her fingers over the camera on my phone, like, bitch, what are you doing? I mean, and she was right. I was too close to the dance floor. I was trying to photograph the lights, but I get it, because what we're trying to avoid is this other image here is from a TikTok that someone made at the same party that got, like tens of thousands of views, and then a whole bunch of teenagers going like, I want to come to this thing. And it's like, well, I'd love to see you there when you're ready, like when you've acquired the skills to navigate this, because this is a party that is not for beginners. Yeah, this is the hardcore. There will be sex on premises, people will do substances. It is like incredibly intense. And there's a bit of a take no prisoners approach to some parts of the dance floor. So I don't think of this world as an exclusive one, but it's one that you sort of work your way into it, and the more skill and knowledge you acquire, the more you know about where those things are going to be, is sort of more how it works. So I end up photographing ambiences a lot, and I'm kind of interested in how light and fog and the use of the portable furniture to construct a situation make spaces that ravers then co-create through our use of that space when we're there. And so these are some of those images. One of those ended up in New Yorker, and I'm sort of wondering, is that too much exposure for this world to sort of end up there? But fortunately, the space is not identifiable in that. This one was a 3-story warehouse, and the whole thing was built out as a constructed situation with sort of light and fog, and all sorts of like interesting furniture in dark corners and things like that. And this again was work by Kip Davis as lighting designer. This was interesting because it wasn't the bright colors for once. There's a slightly different palette to part of it. You can see the like polyurethane tiles on the ceiling of the office. I love the idea that we're using this office space to actually do all this work, but we're going to work all night and all morning producing absolutely nothing at all except heat. That's all we're going to make. So most of our jobs, I think, are compromised, with the military and entertainment complex. But it's like, no, we're going to be working really hard and making nothing. Seems like, not a bad thing to be doing. So to put it in a sort of aesthetic frame, I'm sure most of you would be familiar with Nietzsche's famous distinction between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. And Dionysian is one language you can apply to these kinds of aesthetic experiences and to a party as form. Maybe that's the thing that it produces. So rather than, the artwork that's perceptible at a distance and whose iconic form is probably the sculpture, but which may invoke the world of dream. And it's actually also not quite the Dionysian as the sort of all-enveloping practice centering music and the loss of self. I'm interested in there's a third category in Nietzsche, and because he says in a paragraph, oh, but then there's the Dionysian of the barbarians, and it's too decentering and too sexual, and he doesn't want to do that. Like he sort of pulls back from that. So it's like, oh, okay, let's do the third category. Let's do the thing Nietzsche didn't want to do. And barbarian is obviously a loaded word, but not coincidentally, it's sort of like non-Western cultures seem to have retained more capacity for forms of whatever that beyond Dionysian experience is. So I'll just wrap up with some concepts that extrude out of the practice. And the first is K-time, ketamine time. You do not have to take ketamine to experience this, but it seemed like a good metaphor for it. The experience of time spooling out sideways of a pocket in time where there's more time. And that struck me as a very contemporary temporal figure. And a good rave produces that, particularly a techno-centered rave. We all know there aren't many good futures. So expanding time sideways is maybe one emotional response to that sense of the lack of modernist future time. But it's not queer time, it's not the sort of embrace of the death drive in Lee Edelman. It's sort of something a little different. And, this book was a philosophy of time as much as anything else, and K-time is central. And every experience of K-time joins the rave continuum. So the conceit of the book is every time you experience that is connected to every other time. There's a parallel temporality that we make as a collective practice that spools out sideways. I was interested in dissociation as a potential kind of aesthetic experience that maybe the rave producers. Trans people are not the only ones who dissociate. People who have experienced trauma often have dissociation as a trauma response. Gender dysphoria will make you dissociate like mad, so we tend to be good at it. And trans people can also be multiply traumatized because transphobia. So is there a way that a thing that we're more likely to do as a disability, a thing that you could also build out as an ability, as a kind of aesthetic practice where it's available, because dissociation is not always available as that. So I thought, all right, let's think about aesthetics of dissociation as practices that happen and where maybe trans people for once can be centered as having particular skills at that. So that was sort of the conceit at the last part of the book. I came up with actually four, but I'll just do three of the forms of dissociative aesthetic that I personally have experienced in rave space, in the rave, which is rave space, euphoria and enlustment. And of course, would take a bit of explaining and read the book, So rave space, I got it from Jessica Dunn Rovinelli, the term, and it is a kind of out-of-body experience, but it's more as though through the repetitive movement of the body, you're able to detach subjectivity from the practice of thinking. So, these are raves for knowledge workers and service workers. Like, it's really hard to shut down the thought process because it's the engine that we use for work. And maybe you can't shut it down, but maybe you can not be in it. So is there a way that the thought stream is just there and you're in rave space where that seems to run in parallel to the body's repeated movement? It's like grace. Sometimes I can make that happen and sometimes I can't, but it's one of the states that I might seek on the dance floor, and it turns out others do too. The other one I called xeno-euphoria. I got that expression from Charity Hardscape. And it's sort of into and not out of embodiment. If there's a way that sometimes dissociation will kick you out of your own body. This is a version of it where rather than get kicked out of your body because it feels alien, you actually embrace its alienness. So for trans people, the experience of the body as alien is very common, but to then be able to embrace that and to actually be at home in your own strangeness, in the alien nature of your own flesh. And it helps if you feel that is distributed into the other body of the dance floor itself. So that's the one that gets you closer to that feeling of the blurring of the boundaries between your body and the bodies around you. And the third one, enlustment, is a little bit more straightforward, as we're into the body, uh, but into the banality of it, like rather than see this as a heightened state, to think of eroticism of the body as like a banal and kind of mammalian thing, and like late into the morning when everybody's covered in sweat and have like worn themselves out of being subjects and into bodies, can you descend towards the mammalian might actually be what that state is about. And sometimes it feels sexy and sometimes it doesn't, but it's definitely a kind of an erotic experience. So those would be like three of the dissociative aesthetics I think to explore in that, like Dionysian of the barbarian kind of terrain. So I've been at this for a few years, and this is one of the regular parties that I go to. I'm second from the right on the front row there, sort of like tits out at like 9 o'clock in the morning. You do not want to know what that room smelled like at that time, and that's sort of like the residue of the fog. And I now know the names of all those people. Like this is sort of my world, this is sort of where I live now. And that's basically it. Like that's sort of the story of how I come at party as formed through rave as practice.
Thank you, Mackenzie. Well, we can open now for questions. Maybe you can make it through the chat, but I think it would be great if you talk to yourselves and ask Mackenzie, what do you know? What do you want to know from her? Well, I can make the first one if you don't mind. Um, Mackenzie, I've been hearing a lot from people in my generation saying that after the pandemic, they never found the same pleasure on the dance floor that they used to have pre-pandemic. I think that the nearly 2 years of confinement and the number of lives lost ended up causing a kind of a generalized depression that was not just emotional, but also physical. I usually say that the couch won during the pandemic. In addition, we had a post-pandemic baby boom in the rave scene with a wave of young people who are always joining in, but who suddenly turned up in mass at the events. Another point might be the issue of digitality, which became more pronounced during the pandemic, and maybe now we've brought some of its aspects over into the so-called physical reality. Um, you rediscover the rave scene after 20 years gap, after a 20 years gap, and during or after your transition. And also, I believe raving was created in this moment between the pandemic, the post and the pre and the post pandemic. So I'm curious, do you hear similar things as well, like that the pleasure of the dance floor is not that they used to be?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't my first pandemic. I was born in 1961. I'm the generation that was sexually active before we even knew what HIV was. And some of my I had 3 attempts to be a gay man, and some were like in that period. So there's a missing generation, and there was this interruption in the continuity of nightlife caused by a pandemic that already happened. And I think a lot of the um, sort of social skill and aesthetic sensibility about how to throw a party and how to be in one had kind of gotten lost, or been turned into a space of mourning. Like I saw all of that happen already. So there's sort of like already a history before we get to the history of this pandemic, which interrupted the New York scene in a very particular way. There are a lot of, like, we call if it's illegal, but it's in a venue that's ticketed, it's a rave. If it's out on the street and it's not ticketed, it's a renegade, so that in terms of language, those things are different. There were a lot of renegades during the lockdown by like upstart promoters and new people coming along, and that changed. You know, some of those people had a following, and so it sort of changed who was doing what where a little bit when we came back to being able to be vaccinated and sort of gather again in public. So there's a particular history to how this latest epidemic affected the texture of it. I struggle a bit with students. I actually teach a course on nightlife because I have all these students who come to New York City, but they don't necessarily know how to enjoy the city, because there've been a lot of interrupters of that and a general tendency to push people out of like interactions with others are always technically mediated, but the thing about a rave is the technics mediates the situation. It's not the vector in between where everybody's on their phone, So I think, I want to shift us a little bit towards, the kinds of techniques that create situations where we can put the phone away and figure out how to deal with each other. And there is a bit of a struggle to get us to that spot again. And that's why I'm sort of interested in the hardcore of rave culture and good at that, if a party keeps you off your phone for 4 hours, that is a major achievement. And I think even a political one in the 21st century, so that sort of matters to me. And it's a conversation that I have in the language of gay New York. It's like, how do we teach the children? Like there's a sense of, you arrive in the scene that is very different from the actual parental world you grew up in. You're a child of this scene now, and who is going to be your mom or your dad? Who's your rave mother? Who's your rave father? That's going to teach you how to be gay and how to be a raver. And there's been a bit of interruption of some of that, and it's a conversation I have with other elders about, like how do we see to it that people learn this and are okay and like not harming themselves, because there's got to admit tendency to self-harm, because some people come who are fucked up, being gay or trans will fuck you up. So how can it be a nurturing space? Is an ongoing conversation, a part of why I'm sort of doing this work around it. So that's sort of some of the pieces. And I find I'm rare as someone, born in the 60s who's still in the scene but not alone. And there's an ongoing conversation among, the people who are now hitting 40 and even mid 40s and so on, of like, is this sustainable? Like, what version of this? Because it's a need. Like, for some people, dancing is a need. But, the thing that works on 20-year-olds for that is not what works for us. We need a sort of somewhat different arrangement of that. I want us to not have that be nostalgia. Like I love going to like the Loft still runs, and they'll play like disco tracks from the 70s, and I love doing that once a year, but I don't want to dwell in a nostalgic space. I'm interested in the contemporary. So how, for those of us who are older, how do you keep touch sonically with the contemporary is, I think, a challenge.
Thank you.
Hello, McKenzie. I'm Clara. Hello. I just want to say thank you so much. I feel totally uplifted, and I have forgot everything about my boring work day. And I learned so much. So thank you.
Yeah, that's been the pleasure of writing this book and talking about it. Is like there's things we all need, but we have to create them together. It's not a thing that you can like consume, like how do we make this together?
Liv?
Thank you. Thank you so much, McKenzie. I'm chiming in as another co-worker here, as I believe Clara made clear that we need to release some tension after a long work day, and this was exactly that. But I have a question after you've taken us so well through the geography and social fabrics of raving about the music itself, because I believe you do mention this in the book and the kind of affects of the music, unlike the body and mind connections, and why some people need that. And I thought it was really interesting in the book, and just I'm here to hear more about the music itself, if you wouldn't mind.
Yeah, and there's distinctive there are distinctive New York flavors of electronic dance music. Deconstructed Club, I think we can claim, and my friend Jeffrey Mack has documented that. That happened a moment before I came back. The three actual sets that I describe in the book are by Juliana Huxtable, Jasmine Infinity, and Takaki Ito. And those tend to be techno, and Takaki Ito is doing this minimal techno, which is just like layering three things at once, you know. I love what Jasmine does, and there's a set that's described in some detail. It was, I think, like 8 hours long or something. Like everybody else canceled, so she just basically played the whole night. You know, it was just sort of surreal. So I sort of described that in detail. And recently, someone was complaining online that they tried to Shazam a Juliana Huxtable set and they couldn't figure it out. And Juliana herself is saying, "Well, I was playing three things at once, like I always do." You know, like of course you can't pick it because I made it. It's made in that moment. So I'm interested in that layering in this direction as sort of like one thing that some DJs do. Yeah, it's like how did the abstractness of techno, its reduction of recognizable they're still there, but a reduction of recognizable sonic footprints from the history of dance music. That it's a more secular music in that it's usually left behind the traces of gospel, which is very important to house music and connects house music to Black sacred tradition. Techno does less of that, so I'm interested in that as a phenomenon. Black sacred tradition is not for me. Like that's not a space I'm included in. Much as I respect it. So yeah, I'm interested in what specifically about some of these forms of music enable forms of aesthetic experience, and then how do we come up with new language for that that's not sort of gonna stick it back in a pigeonhole. I have very Catholic taste though, and I'm a bit of a rave bimbo. I don't even know who's playing half the time. You know, if I like it, I dance. So it's not a book that centers the DJ. I wanted to not do that because that is one thing. There's plenty of books about the DJ in dance music writing, and it's like, that's great, and I respect DJs, but I don't want to do that, you know. A promoter whose name I won't mention once told me, you know, like, it's easy to get DJs, try finding a cleaning crew.
Aste, I guess, before Matilda. Am I right?
Yeah. Yeah. Hi. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed that, and so many things that are both on theme to stuff I've been thinking a lot about lately, and also things that we looked at in the residency this summer as well. We were looking at party personas and you know, very, very close to some of the social types that you're talking about. And my own work as well is a lot about looking at personalization of interactions. And it's interesting because, you know, most of the constructions of sort of personality science or personas really focus on this sort of, or even if they don't consciously highlight it, the sort of underscore separation, you know, the sort of unitary self in a way. And, you know, something about Leo's question as well made me think in terms of, you know, we're talking about rave and the dance floor as being the space where the technology gets out of in between, you know, whether we're mediated or not, at least it's not in between us, right? But what I was wondering about a little along those lines is whether the amount of time we've spent in these kind of mediated digital spaces that treat us, you know, or that imply a separate and unitary ongoing existence as a sort of a baseline, make it harder to access exactly, you know, is that the part of the reason why the dance floor we might find it harder to lose ourselves at the dance floor? And, you know, for me, I guess in some ways, I'm like, paradoxically maybe looking at personalization, but I'm specifically interested in how we talk about selves in ways that make those shared social states more accessible. And I do feel like the dance floor and the rave and the party have a lot to offer there. And like, how do we is there new formulations of these kind of social types perhaps that could help us in doing that? So I'm wondering if you might have thoughts on that.
Yeah, the techniques of the cell phone and the laptop might be. I'm always interested in what's ambivalent about technologies. Like how do they sort of head in both directions? That, yeah, you see a thing where people, like they show up at the party, they're not regular dancers, they're like a little bit anxious about it, and their first instinct is to get the phone out, and you see that. But there are always people who are anxious about getting onto the dance floor. Like my anxiety about it as a teenager was like, oh, if as soon as the music's playing, I want to dance, but then everyone will think I'm gay. And I just sort of like, I guess I just don't care. So it'd be like me and a bunch of girls would all dance. And, in like white Anglophone culture, straight men don't really dance. It's not a thing. This varies in different cultures, but in the one I'm from, like it's just, that was a boundary. So there are always things that are sort of pushing people out of, that sense of dancing as a little bit of loss of self and loss of the appearance of a certain kind of integrity. And the other thing I left out of the talk, but like the rave only works if you let the music fuck you, and I choose that word very intentionally. Like everybody is gay on the dance floor because it is a sexuality to be engaged with the music, and a lot of people can't get there, and that's fine. It doesn't have to be for everyone. But I think, yeah, in what way do the techniques of sociality shape possibilities? What possibilities can we draw out of things like cellular telephony? Like a lot of finding out where raves are is organized through Discords and through Instagram. So it sort of like serves you in a way too, is that it makes it possible to find out what's going on and where. I can get a situation report on the party before I show up. I just asked the Discord, is it hot in there? Do I need to bring a layer? That wasn't possible before. So yeah, I'm interested in sort of the ambiguities of that. But I'm interested in, like club kids are very much about the production of mediatable personas. Ravers not so much. Like ravers show up in like gym clothes, and it's fine, and we can like share the space and have slightly different uses. But if for someone working indoor, like the raver is the person who's going to show up in basic black because everything is like filthy as all hell in these places. So from experience to wear black, and then sensible shoes. It's just like, all right, you're in. Because we know you're going to dance. So yeah, there's nuance to these things. There's without elaborating too far is what I'd want to say about it.
Matilda?
Hello, I hope I'm joining on my phone. So, but yeah, thank you so much. There's been this kind of big rise of day festivals in London over the past couple of years, which I think London's always had a very problematic relationship to allowing nightlife. I think it's really wanted by the city and very much not wanted by the kind of planning, by the kind of bureaucratic elements of the city. But yeah, I've seen this big rise in sort of like sanctioned day festivals. And I was wondering if you could say a little bit maybe about kind of day versus night and indoor versus outdoor in terms of achieving some of the kind of trans aesthetics that you were mentioning earlier, like rave space and xeno euphoria. Like how do these new versions of raves, which are maybe slightly more sanitized, impact the ability to kind of enter into those aesthetics?
Yeah, and London I know nothing about. I don't even know if I've ever been dancing in London, to be honest. And I missed its important, like moments when it contributed to this evolution. So it's not that specifically I can't talk about. Yeah, like I love most things I'm going to start at 11:59. And then they run maybe till 11 o'clock the next morning, and I'm there for the second half. I'm also very fond of the Sunday indoor, usually thought of as an afters, that'll start at 5 a.m., go to 5 p.m. is a format that's a little less popular. It tends to be a smaller, much more hardcore kind of crowd. Love those. They're not financially viable in New York, so they tend to be a bit of a labor of love production. And because you often don't have complete control of the light in the space, because the daylight will leak in, it sort of feels a little different. But yeah, it's sort of here for that. The outdoor that I love is there's sort of outdoor 3-4 day music festivals in North America. My favorite's Honcho Camp Out, which is super gay. You know, it's 1,000 circuit gays and a few, you know, like ring-in queers. And if there are straight people there, they are keeping it on the DL, you know. Straight people do not hold hands at you know, at Honcho. I love that. And it's very much the outdoor space sort of matters with that one. And but it's remote. It's a sort of remote sort of campground sort of thing. Yeah, I'm not really someone who shows up for the, you know, I should go to Movement in Berlin, sorry, in Detroit, but don't. So it sort of seems not really quite my thing. But you know, there's so many different flavors of what dancing can be, and I think the important thing is to have lots of different ones. And because I know a lot of people who work in this professionally, the more the better, because it's more work. You know, it's like, oh great, so none of us will go to this day festival because it looks really cursed and it has corporate sponsors, but our friends get to work it and the money is good, so here for it. And maybe there's people who learn through that that's not quite what they want, and then they're ready for some other sorts of experiences. I don't think it's ever sort of either or, you know. Dancing is good for everybody, right? And let's have different versions of it that meet different needs. And if there's different versions of it, then people aren't all expecting to get their different needs met at the same club or at the same rave, because that's a whole thing, you know. Like you go to Boston Over Civic Club here in New York, which is like a little home for techno, and it's like, why did you bring your bridal shower here? You know, like it's so many bars you could go to. So it's like, maybe we could think a little bit more about, you know, like what's appropriate where.
Kelly, do you want to ask something?
Yeah, I did have a question. Yeah, thanks
Okay.
for clocking my hand. Yeah, thank you for directing traffic, Leo. Thank you so much for this talk, McKenzie. It's, you know, it's just been such a pleasure, and I've learned so much, and I feel like I've written down all of these texts very poorly, and I won't be able to read my handwriting, so I'll track it down. But yeah, one of the conversations that we had kind of repeatedly at the residency was about the kit. And whenever I think about kind of ethnographers, it's like they've got a kit. And then whenever I think about moms, it's like moms definitely have a kit. And so, and then also when you were speaking about like supportive roles and how important they are within the rave, and then also something that you said around like reduction of anxiety and how I feel like I give myself a role at a party in part to help reduce anxiety. So my question is around like, what's your kit? What's in it, like practically, theoretically, emotionally, like what's in your rave kit?
Yeah, and you know, from the psychedelic community, set and setting are sort of useful concepts there. Is this a place that's going to be available for a certain experience? And do I have the mindset to enjoy that? You know, am I in a good place that I can actually sort of embrace that? I didn't mention, like, I'm out as a recreational drug user. I've been a drug user for 50 years and have, you know, had a professional life and raised a family. Like, we exist, you know, like I have friends who need to be sober, and that's very important. I am not. So drugs are part of the kit is the thing that I'm saying with that. And so I'm looking for, you know, so then is this a situation where I feel I can do that, and am I in the mental space to do that? And are my friends here? You know, the people here who would help me if I need that, and who I am then also obligated to. if they need help, you know, or even just to sit with somebody for a bit, you know. So there's that bit of it. The more practical thing is, like, I just changed my footwear recently. I'm using hiking boots instead of trainers. I think I need more support. So like that's an important part of kit. There's a photograph of my little rave bag, which just broke. I have to go get it fixed. I've used the same bag forever. There's a photo of that, and you know, so it's you know, wallet, phone, fan, earplugs, very important, backup earplugs, vape for weed, which is now legal in New York City, so you can carry that anywhere. Somewhere to hide some ketamine, you know, in the kit somewhere. Raves don't search thoroughly, but places, legal venues do sometimes. And there are places where security will hunt for your drugs and then try to sell them back to you. And I do not go twice to venues where that is the practice. So yeah, like the actual physical kit's kind of important. Mine's very light because I live in walking distance from a lot of this, but I have friends who also, like, you know, I just know who I can hit up. You know, I'm like, Tim, have you got eye drops? And it's always like, yes. It's like, oh, thank you, girl. I need eye drops, you know. So I know people have much more extensive kit than that, you know. Collapsible water bottle is a popular one. I usually just, you know, I'll just scavenge one and refill it, you know. That's kind of important. So yeah, there's that sense of, yeah, what's the little bundle of actual physical things. Wrap. I started this, and I wish I hadn't. I usually take a plastic bag, like a trash bag, so I can put my coat in the trash bag and hide it without getting schmutz on it, dirt on it. And everybody else started copying it. So now I'm like, which of these bags is mine? You know. So yeah, so I understand. And your question's in two parts. And yes, there's sort of emotional kit and social kit sort of matters, and then there's like here are the little tools that kind of make this you know. Oh, and of course, like a key, you know, like you got to do your bumps off something, you know. I have like a particular tool for that. Yeah.
Francis?
Hi, thanks so much for that, McKenzie. I came in a bit late, so I missed the beginning of the presentation, but yeah, what I heard was just made me feel very positively about traveling to a party later this week. So I'm pleased that yeah, feeling good about that, which is nice. I actually had a question more about the music too, in terms of what maybe jumping off a previous question about abstraction, or your previous answer about abstraction in terms of techno. A friend of mine wrote a piece about donk music, which I don't know if it's familiar to people. Or maybe you know Donna anyway. I don't know if you've read this piece, but I guess the premise of it is this question about reality versus abstraction, the kind of like donk being supposedly the sound of something hitting a metal pipe, like this kind of real versus the synthesized noise of techno. And I guess I wondered how reality and maybe romanticism or idealization fits in with the aesthetics of partying that you were talking about.
Yeah, donk's not a thing that's sort of taken off in my world. I mean, the other genre that's around a little bit would be drum and bass is a thing that's had a bit of a comeback, which I dearly love dancing to. It's hard to get to that intersection of a queer party and drum and bass, but when you sort of find that, yeah, you know, I just have, you know, I'll dance to absolutely anything. I was just like Octo Octo and Eris Meyer are playing New York soon, and I was just making sure I've got a list for that. And it's house music, you know, like I can get into that. But it has, in terms of things that I really love, it's got a little bit too much song structure and vocal and things like that. And there's a very particular emotional repertoire that it will work. So I think my keyword for thinking about techno is abstraction. And yeah, there's and I do like it to have attention to timbre. I think is sort of what's appealing as a dancer, is like, oh, when are we getting like the richness and detail of how each particular sound has been sculpted? And I suspect that one of the effects of ketamine is to narrow your focus to very particular things, like you're generally losing dimensions of sensitivity, but you also gain like precision. So having a sound that you can hear it like very precisely in a track, in a mix, and how that moves, like that seems to me to be kind of appealing. I don't like to over-intellectualize dance music. I personally think intelligent dance music was a racist category, and I don't think we should revisit that. The whole point of this music is to move you, is like its point is physical. So it's like whatever does that culturally for a particular constituency is the sort of the thing that matters. And that varies a little bit even within sort of queer and trans New York, you know, the things that Black dance floors like are going to be different. And I like respect that and like to be on the periphery of it. But it won't be culturally where I've come from a bit. So I'm like, and also it's like it's not my space, right? But it's like if you allow me to be around the edge of this, thank you. But here's this other space that connects to people's particular like sonic histories and corporeal histories.
Simona?
Okay. Hi, Mackenzie. Hello. Can you hear me? Hi.
Yeah.
Hello. Hi. My question is more about the relationship between music, text, and spoken words. Last time I saw you, you were reading part of your text during a physical party in
Oh, which one?
Yeah, in Geneva.
You were there?
Yes, it's me.
In Geneva. Oh, that was a
Yes.
great night. Hi.
Hello. Yes, and I remember that was like 30, 40 minutes where your text was basically one unison with the music, and it felt really natural, this combination of text and music. And so I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit. So what that moment, it was not a lecture, of course. It was you were in the music, you were in the rhythm, and those like gaps in between one spoken words and the sonic samples were kind of part of one entire thing. I was just wondering if you could say something about it.
That was a good party. Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah.
My friends from Rome, Merende, did a version of
Yes.
their party, which it unfortunately had to end at like 3 or 4, I think.
Yes.
It didn't go all through, but actually this is sort of like just as a side note, a reason I sort of don't always stay for the party when I'm on tour is like I was just like, oh, this is my friends and this is gonna be great. I'm gonna get really fucking high and dance all morning. And then it's 3 a.m. and it's like, I guess I'm going to learn if it is safe for a middle-aged transsexual to walk across Genoa in the middle of the night. And as it turned out, it was, but I had no way of knowing in advance because I'd never been in the city before. So it's like, you know, like when I travel, I don't go to the party because like no one's around to get me back to the hotel. And like disasters have happened where I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I'm sleeping on this park bench tonight, you know, so I'm too old for that shit. But yeah, I made it back, you know. Yeah, so I do, it doesn't work over Zoom. I would never do it in this format.
Yeah.
And I much prefer to do it in nightclubs. So I've had tracks made for me that I can do readings to. And the first ones were even made for a very specific sound system in New York. So I could read over these beats and it's left space for my voice and the sub bass is in it. So I started doing those at Writing on Raving to take advantage of, we have all this club techniques for a reading series, like why should it not be with beats, you know? Like you do a reading in a bookstore, it'll be like some shitty little speaker this big, you know, and you're under like fluorescent lights, like there's readings in bookstores are never as sonically, visually all that great, you know, but do a reading series in a club, then you can, let's experiment with this as form, you know? Yeah, so I did a version of that at Genoa, and I've loved touring with that. It's been a lot of fun, but you sort of need the infrastructure to do it. And it's like, yeah, why not? What if we thought of a rhythmic sonic bed, and then it's not, I'm not a rapper, that's not for me, you know. So it's spoken word, but with beats. And it's a little different. The particular spoken word pieces are common in techno. One is sort of self-help new agey shit, shows up a lot, and I'm a bit over that. And some is sort of like spooky alien voices is a whole thing. No, let's not do that. So it's sort of about the experience. Like, what if it's narrated with a beat? And the thing that really makes me happy is when DJs put it in sets, because you can get them off SoundCloud, that like isolated vocal and also the track, and every now and then I hear it in a mix. I'm like, oh, that's my voice. That went out to a dance floor, you know. There's a gap between, you know, sort of the writerly and dancing. Like, they're not forms that automatically go together, and it's interesting to work in that gap a little bit. And that was a particularly fun. I also got Eugenio to read over beats, and he never even read the book. I'm just like, read this page in Italian. I just met Eugenio, and I'm like, oh, you're going to be good. You've got personality, you know. And he just like stole the show.
It took a little bit too much space, but it was amazing. Yeah, he just.
Oh no,
yeah.
I gave it. I had him on a timer because I'm like, oh, my girl can go forever, so I'm just like, all right. I just tapped him on the shoulder, you know. And
So
yeah,
cool.
so that was a great party. So yeah, I love doing that. And I did that in Rome. We did a bit of that there. Was how that one came about.
Yes, thank you.
Fergus?
Hello. Hi, McKenzie. Thanks for a great talk. I had a question about the kind of physical space associated with partying, and how kind of, I suppose, with raving, it's synonymous with these like warehouse spaces or like basement venues or something like that. But I thought it was interesting when you mentioned the kind of office space and how that was like quite contrasting with, or not contrasting because it was still at work, but how you think the spaces have changed for raving, and now that perhaps the industrial spaces that would have been used in the past maybe aren't available anymore, or that's associated with a kind of nostalgic idea of raving. And yeah, how you feel that the physical spaces have changed and how that's impacted the parties.
Yeah, you know, I wasn't there for the sort of Northern England factory rave moment. I never experienced it. There's a tiny bit of that happened in Australia. There's a distinction, I think, between factory and warehouse. Like warehouses, the warehouses that are available now in New York are actually pretty small. So some of these parties, you know, like 400 would be a big party. Some of them are like 100, and it's more like a warehouse space, and it's usually got a bit of office attached to it. And there's like literally a 10-block radius that's light industrial zoned in Brooklyn, where a lot of it happens. And you sort of wonder at what point is the city going to repurpose that, and we're sort of looking for somewhere else. There's some sort of very adventurous promoters who are sort of looking further in Brooklyn. They're like looking around it. And one of the skills of promoters is venue hunting, you know, is like knowing landlords, knowing land use, knowing police precincts, you know, of like, what if we try over there, you know, like here's this space with no residential around it, you know, people come this far out. There's a whole art to it. But I think, yeah, there's something specific to the underutilization of warehouse type space. It's not even industrial. There's a famous one here called Chocolate Factory, but I don't think it's even ever been a chocolate factory. It was a warehouse, is most common. There's a couple of photo studios that get used. I'm interested in that repurposing of space. You know, can you give space a different function by constructing a situation in it? But yeah, this is different in terms of it's not factory, and it's different in terms of the population that's going to go is sort of not that post-industrial former working class. It's sort of like urban knowledge worker, email job, service worker kind of crowd that's sort of showing up.
Oh, I'm sorry, Sarah?
Yeah, thanks, Theo. Thank you so much, McKenzie. This has been fantastic. I wanted to ask, Fergus kind of stole my question. But I wanted to ask about the interior architecture of these spaces. It seems to like in a big open space like this, then you can kind of create zones as you've talked about, especially through light and through sound and kind of behavior or mentality maybe. And I wonder if that creates for you a similar map in different spaces, or like what's happening where, how you find who or what you want to encounter or experience that night. And if this seems, if that seems to take place at all parties, if there are zones that recur, or if each one sets up differently and how those are accomplished.
Yeah, it's interesting to see different raves use the same venue and transform the space differently. The other tool is sort of curtains as sort of partition. Thing about a sort of a warehouse space is it's usually got like a big open space, but it'll have like office spaces and other smaller spaces available as well. So it's like, oh, okay, so is the DJ going to be in the middle and do sound in the round, or is it against this wall or that wall? There's often a dark room for on-premises sex. Is it that room or this other one? And can we put a second bar up there? Or could we even have a second like DJ or an ambient room? So it's interesting to see like, you know, different sort of uses of the space by different promoters sort of like figuring out. You know, and it's sort of, I think of it as like constructed situation, but then, you know, you come into that as a raver and you and everybody else are kind of like, oh, okay, so that shapes certain possibilities for how we use space, but the rest of it's a little bit up to us, you know. What are we going to do? Are we going to all just hang out and talk in this little corner over there, or are people going to have sex there, or, and, you know, can fog change what sorts of activities people will do where? And light, of course, is sort of like your other tool. So yeah, I'm sort of interested, like, and some promoters are better at it than others. Like some really have that down to sort of shaping possibilities for what you might want to do in the space, and some are a bit more bare bones and more likely to be music centered, you know, like they're so excited they booked this DJ, but there's just a few basic lights, you know. whereas I like attention to those sorts of things.
Any more questions? Or
I have one if there's time. Thanks, McKenzie. This has been a great presentation. I was really at a moment when you were showing your photographs of some of the raves, where it dawned on me that my favorite documents of parties almost have no information in them, right? Like they're almost like deliberately construed to just kind of present a mystery about the party. So if you have a set of lights and fog, that almost evokes or draws me into like, what is this party? What was it about? More than say something that describes the people who are there or kind of apparatus that was in the room that made the event an event. And I guess it just, I wonder about this notion of like, you know, you had to be there to know what the party was. And if you have any kind of awareness or when you're creating documents or you're thinking about telling the story of the party, is there a kind of an awareness of a kind of core mystery about the party that should never be touched, never be talked about, or never be described, or maybe it's impossible to do so? Yeah, I don't know if any of that.
I mean, maybe there's things that I'm not talking about, and also I'm not going to talk about not talking about them. Yeah, you know, like I don't want an extractive or tourist relation to a world, you know, like not everything needs exposure, really. So yeah, and certain things, there's in general a thing I think about doing research and then documenting and teaching creative worlds. Like there's some things you put in the book, there's certain stories you only tell who needs to know. Like there's things I know about the Situationists I didn't put in the book, you know. Maybe I couldn't get a second source, or it's just a juicy rumor, but like sometimes that stuff has to pass on through a different network, you know. there's different ways information can travel. The photos took a lot of thought. I think it was iPhone 11 was the one that was the game changer. And you know, it's not a camera, it's a computer that makes images. And what it wants to make images of is landscapes and faces. So it's really confused by ambiances. And that was actually sort of fun to play with, to see how it would react to that. But it was the first one that worked in very low light and could capture quite a bit of detail. I sort of had, you know, differences of opinion with Duke University Press, because they were like, oh, these photos aren't high resolution enough. And I'm like, that's the point. The point is the pixelation. Like that's the texture is what I want to show, you know. Like some of those photos have been in like art magazines like this big, you know, like great, like you can see into the grain of the image, and there's a thing you can't see past the grain, you know. It's this little E.L. Weitzman thing, you know, like what's beyond the threshold of resolution is kind of interesting. So yeah, I had a very particular aesthetic with doing the photos, that are just sort of looking for ambiances and also sort of abstraction, you know, like the abstraction is already going on in the lighting design, but I can sort of demonstrate that rather than centering. There's so many freaking nightlife photos of like ecstatic dancers with their hands up and shit, you know, and I don't do that, and I don't want to expose anybody. You know, no one's going to be recognizable in photos. One exception is an outdoor thing, where I actually wanted a couple of people to be recognizable because they're icons.
Thanks.
Questions? Maybe we can do it. Aste, well, maybe Aste, let Teeny make the first one. It's okay with you, Aste, because you already asked McKenzie.
I didn't mean to sneak. I mean, still have a few minutes. I'll try to be quick then. Thank you once again. I think it's like pretty unique 1.5 hour that we are part of here, and I feel like being an audience, a promoter, I'm partly a raver myself, and I'm it's all these aspects that that I think of that creates the space where this mindset can, you know, come and rise. But I just wanted to ask if I mean, of course you do, but if you have a few thoughts around like how vulnerable this space is for like the people being in it, because I'm thinking like mindset is one thing, the space itself and some kind of site specificity, but also like the people, the actual people at that space, in that city at that time, how important that is. And I'm just asking because to me, doing this for a few years, I think it's like almost impossible, even if you have the right mindset, to achieve this kind of state at certain, you know, sites. So for a few years, I went to Berghain in Berlin to get this, and it was unlike all other places I've been, and that's, you know, mostly because of the people. You can dance without being interrupted. You can dance and just, you know, forget where you are. At least, yeah. I'll stop there.
Yeah, I'm only ever a visitor if I go to Berghain, because I've never lived in Berlin for any large space of time. But yeah, I've had that experience there of like, oh, everybody here gets it, you know, like people know how to use the space. I've also been deliberately like knocked out of the way by gay men at Berghain. So, you know, like no spaces without its, you know, like another thing worth saying is everybody brings their aggression, and it's the thing is how you work it out. Like, you know, punishers work it out against you. But we all have that aggression, but it's like, oh, okay, you can sublimate that into movement, into your relation to the space. And so how does that work? And it's also why I like a later dance floor, because people have often worked a bit of that off. And it sort of starts to get into a different kind of vibe, you know. Not every dance floor gels, you know, like not every party works. It doesn't always work for everybody. It's, you know, like you really are chasing kind of a lightning in the bottle kind of experience. And a conversation I have quite often with ravers is like, has it worked for you lately? You know, sometimes you go a long time. It's like grace in the Protestant tradition. There's nothing you can do to make it happen. It comes when it wants, you know. But you can actually kind of create the situation where it's more likely for that to appear, you know. There's elements of the Brooklyn scene that are modeled on Germany, on Berlin in particular. And you know, I know people who studied it and then tried to sort of reverse engineer it here, but you never have a building like Berghain and never have a relationship with the city like that in New York. Like, that's not possible. So it was more, we're going to do something else because the constraints of money, policing, regulation, you know, those function differently. And also culturally, it's a little different too. And you know, it's sort of important in the New York context. Can we center blackness, for example? Like, that is a thread that I think it's important not to lose on this side. And where I don't find people think about as much in the German context. So yeah, there's, I think, particular spaces that we're trying to nurture, and we all know it won't last. You know, like this scene will end at some point, and then, you know, maybe somebody else will create the next one, hopefully in the city. I read, you know, in an interview about the death of the Williamsburg scene, this horrible phrase, post-cultural, like parts of the city are now post-cultural. And I'm like, that is so true. There's nothing there but a fucking mall. You know, if you go to Williamsburg now, there's so little left. Really hate to see that, even though I'm part of the engine of the gentrification of the city myself, as a white bitch that's living in what used to be a Puerto Rican neighborhood, you know, so I'm not innocent in relation to that. So yeah, it's always sort of like fugitive, and you're just trying to find the space where, with some intention, skill, attention, kind of create a possibility for what, for me, is what the city is supposed to be about, where there will be a space where people come together in the night, and we will discover each other in a way that's not available in our daytime interactions, and meet people that you would not otherwise know on some always slippery and honored in the breach basis of equality. Yeah, like, that's sort of important too, you know. Or where there is a hierarchy of value, but it's reversed. In this world, you know, a party is a good party if the dolls show up. And the dolls are a particular subset of trans women. I'm not one. If the dolls come to your party, it is blessed. Yeah. And it doesn't always happen. They don't always come, or they don't always stay, you know. And they're not valued anywhere else in the world. But here, you know, like, they matter. And that's the heart, you know. So yeah, this is maybe a place to end the whole thing, but yeah, it's like, I don't want to use sort of inherited language for describing this. So can we sort of think through a language that would capture some of that and honor it? And I wanted to write in a way that would be sort of like a little bit of a gift back for a thing that's given me so much.
Thank you, McKenzie. Thank you, guys. I think we ran out of time, but yeah, it was awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, so a huge thank you to you, McKenzie, and also to you, Leo, for moderating. It's been really fantastic talk and conversation afterwards. Thank you to everyone who also brought questions to the conversation.